back to boot camp. I hope that you've been seeing progress in the work that you've been doing around visioning and developing your vision statement for a variety of environments. There are many people that will find this study today the most dry, uninspiring, annoying. But we got to go there. We got to go to the issue of stewardship and fund development and think about this whole issue of your business plan and how it relates to your ministry plan. The two have to kind of talk together in order for you to really be effective. So without trying to dance around this any further, let me go immediately to this question of why is this so important? It's because spirituality and fundraising are deeply related subjects. For church planners, getting this work going early is foundational to disciple making, organizational sustainability, ministry planning. After all, it was Jesus who taught us to count the cost. You can find that in the parables of Jesus. I could tell you so many stories of planters that have failed to prioritize this issue. And I've heard so many wise planters talk about how they gave considerable emphasis to this area, right down to the simple practice of expecting every member of their core team, whenever they make a commitment to be part of their launch team, that they must make a financial commitment to the ministry or they really are not part of the launch team. Establishing clarity, that ought to be part of your plan as well. In your thinking and clarity in your messaging around funding, as well as clarity in your planning. That's really what this section is all about. And there's no better place to start than getting a hold of Henry Nouwen's little book, The Spirituality of Fundraising. Read Nouwen. He does a wonderful job of outlining the connection between faith and fundraising. There's a number of online sources that we've provided for you. Smart Thinking About Church Plant Sustainability. I would strongly encourage you spend time with that document. Some of the smartest church planters I know, when they begin to form their small groups in preparation for ministry launch, they pass the hat at every one of their small group gatherings when those groups are functioning prior to the beginning of public worship. And they set a goal for each of those groups, that those groups would generate $500, $600, $700, $1,000 a month in giving. They understand that each person with a job is capable of giving a certain amount. They think about what are the thresholds, the various steps up the scale of giving growth. And they go after that subject early on, believing that it's easier to grow an existing giver from a little to more than it is to start a giver from scratch whenever they've already gotten involved in the ministry and they've calibrated that giving is not something I need to do. So you don't want to avoid this subject. You want to be thinking wisely about it. Nouwen will help you do that. You want to be messaging wisely about it, and you want to be planning wisely about it. There's some online sources around fundraising. There's some documents that have been placed online. We also have on the webpage downloadable training on raising funds and developing stewardship values and stewardship practices. Strongly recommend it in your setting. As well as a document there on step-by-step guide for your initial budget, and a link you'll find there in that preparation section for a budgeting workshop. I hope that you'll fully take advantage of those resources. Most of us didn't go to seminary expecting to have to raise funds, and yet you cannot do ministry without it. In fact, fundraising and donor development and stewardship formation has a marvelous capacity to grow discipleship. You haven't really made a disciple if you haven't developed a giver. This is going to get kind of dense today, but I'm looking forward to walking with you through it. I'm glad to pick up the phone and talk with you about it on your initiative. You really have to begin by understanding financial sustainability is the objective of your ministry. You're really a mission if you aren't sustainable at some point. And by sustainable, I mean locally sustainable. Some folks would like their ministry to be sustained by donors that will give money that are not involved in the ministry, that are not attenders of the ministry. But those donors are going to get donor fatigue over time. Those donors are going to be a nice excuse for other people not to give. I've had many, many church planters say, well, my people aren't able to give. And that's simply not true. That's simply not true. The average salary in North America is $40,000 a year. And if you can get people to give 3% on that salary, and you can get 100 people with a job to give 3% on that salary, you can have a ministry that can be sustainable with a full-time employed pastoral leader and many of the other features of a steady ministry. Now, granted, it'll be a bare-bones ministry. It'll be a ministry that'll be, to some extent, Spartan in many settings. But it will not be a ministry that will be crippled by being constantly dependent on outside donors. You can do this. And I've had, again, planters that have insisted that they can't. And if you insist that you can't, you'll grow a weak church plant where people will not fully be committed. They'll constantly be looking for someone else to make sacrificial decisions and to make the big decisions because they won't feel like they're an appropriate ownership by virtue of their commitment to the ministry. They'll think of themselves as just consumers rather than partners, and that's not healthy. 200 people with a job in order for your ministry to be sustainable because perhaps your people are at a lower income bracket. If so, so be it. Or maybe you'll have to be in a half-time appointment. But it's just not acceptable to build a church on donations that come from outside of those that are involved in the church. It's just not acceptable. It builds a very short-term ministry that will not be there after you leave in most cases. It will be a flash in the pan. Here's what the Center for Missional Research tells us, that 30% of churches are sustainable in year one. Those are the churches that take off in a remarkable way, and they have a developer that has pushed stewardship and made the courageous ask of people from the very beginning. 40% are sustainable in year 2, 50% are sustainable in year 3, 60% are sustainable in year 4. But churches that receive outside funds beyond year 5 never become sustainable virtually. If you're expecting that your church is going to receive funding beyond the 5th year, there's a chance that you're going to be forever dependent, crippled by the need for outside funds. So the clock is ticking. You want to move towards the sustainability objective. So our goal is for your ministry to be sustainable within those first 3-4 years, and if necessary, into the 5th year. That means that your internal giving fully funds a full or a part-time appointment and the expenses that the ministry incurs. Let's talk about your ministry budget. Your ministry budget should be realistic. It needs to be agreed upon by your stakeholders and in sync with the season of planting that you're in. I've watched church plants that have made some bad moves around this one. The church plant that secured a building before they really had a congregation, established a lease relationship with a vendor, and then as they struggled, they could not afford the lease. Furthermore, it didn't make sense for them to even use the property because they were so small, they would be swallowed up by the size of the meeting room. And so the meeting room sat unused for 18 months, and we paid the vendor for 18 months. The church closed after about 6 months. For a year, continued to pay the vendor. The loss to the conference was substantial. The mistake that was made there was that the planter somehow was able to sign a lease and encumber the annual conference with that lease without getting the approval of their stakeholders. What they had done is that they had not considered the season of planting that they were in, that they still had to gather and use small groups as the gathering point, and they did not need a space yet. They prematurely encumbered themselves financially. Similar mistakes are made around prematurely encumbering a ministry around staffing those staffing decisions need to be approved from the perspective of your stakeholders. A word of caution, please take heed. When you think about how is it that your congregation can be sustainable in that second, third, or fourth year, what's that look like? I think you begin by asking the question, how many people with a full-time job could you gather and gain a commitment to give in 4 years? A good target would be 100. If you could get 100 people gathered and committed, you could see that you would have a congregation that would be of some good size. Some of you can do more than that. Some of you, because of your context or because of gifts or because of the uniqueness of the people you're going after, it may be less. But we'd like to see at least 100 givers. That means 100 people with a job after 4 years. What amount of giving per month can be expected from those that you gather? The national average is $120 a month per person with a job. Now let me qualify that. If a person is committed to your ministry by being involved in a small group, and if you have asked them to make a commitment and they have done so in a semi-formal way, signing something or what have you, then the average of that commitment would be somewhere around $120 per month per person with a job. If you expect people to make that commitment without you putting the ask to them, don't expect them to go to that level. If they aren't involved in a small group or they're just peripheral, don't expect them to go to that level. You have to get them involved and have the commitment conversation. That begins to give you then a sense of what your giving potential is. Because if you add up the number of people that you think you can gather in 4 years, and we've already talked about some of the gathering activity during the overview session. We've talked about making 1,000 contacts in a community. We've talked about developing 4 to 5 small groups before you launch. Multiply that number of people that you think you can gather by $120 and multiply that number by 12 months in the year, and that gives you what your total sustainable budget could be. Your salary and ministry expenses should not exceed that amount. Now, this is a good time to step back and do some sober thinking. Say, how many people can I gather? How many do I need to gather? Very, very concrete thinking. Hopefully will help you think more clearly about the work of gathering and the importance of the steps around gathering, because we want to be able to see your ministry sustainable in that 3rd, 4th, or 5th year. So how many internal givers will you need then to raise up to be givers in each individual year? We now understand where we want to be after 4 years and the ministry is sustainable. Now let's break it down into the steps that we're going to take in order to get there. So how many internal givers will we have in year 1? How many in year 2? How many in year 3? And go through the same process of multiplying each year's total givers by the monthly average gift, that by 12, to calculate your internal giving for that year. You can now begin to get a picture when you look at the difference. The difference between your internal giving and your total sustainable budget need, which would be what your ministry is going to need in year 4, that difference from year 1, which would be quite substantial because you have very few internal givers. Year 2, a little less. Year 3, still a little less need for outside support, a little more internal giving. You can begin to get a picture of what the total amount of outside funding need is going to be from the annual conference. By adding those yearly differences between internal giving and your total budget need, you should be able to get a picture of what your total external support need is. You should also, again, have a picture of how many donors you need to be developing each year. I had a conversation with a church planter recently who was doing a really smart thing. They were taking this conversation to the individuals in their network of launch team members, one person at a time, over lunch or over coffee. You see, they understood the basic principle that if you broadcast a need widely and generically, you use a letter or you use an email, you get a very, very poor response. But if you sit down with people individually, you share with them what the ministry plan is, what the budget need is, what the growth plan is, what the financial sustainability plan is, people will take it far more seriously, and they'll step up much further to their capacity. And so having those individual conversations, which in this particular case, this planter had neglected, they definitely dialed up their intentionality when they began to meet with people one-on-one. And they had a marvelous response. That people responded far stronger than they ever expected these individuals to respond. That sustainability calculator is something that you need to do, create clarity in your own mind around your financial picture. Developing external funding sources. How much will you need to receive from donors external to your plant? We've identified that amount now, the total amount. The annual conference is going to contribute to some degree to your plant. There'll also probably be the expectation that you raise 10% of the startup costs from friends and family and develop a plan to do that. There's a reason why we do this. Your fundraising around the startup phase of your church plant is terribly productive because many people want to support you in what you're doing. And it allows us as the annual conference to draw more and more people into this ministry of planting and developing and doing mission work in North America. Asking your friends and family to raise 10% of your startup costs is good for them, it's good for our overall mission work, and it's good for you. Because when you begin to do this with friends and family, it's going to invest them deeply into another dimension that we're going to talk about in a few moments. Namely, the growing of your prayer team. When people begin to give to your ministry, they want to pray about it too. When you form a prayer and giving relationship with folks that may not be attending, they're going to bond with you and want to see you succeed in a powerful way. So you'll be empowered to do that by viewing the stewardship videos that are referred to at the top end of this training and the link that's to the web page. Those stewardship videos will help you understand biblical foundations in a deeper way, I would hope. They'll grant you clarity around how you help people change their behavior with respect to their giving and change their attitude towards their money. And they'll help you communicate organizational worthiness and the wisdom, or shall I say the value of your ministry and how people would be smart to make a contribution. Those training videos will help you with effective communications and with some fundraising methods. As part of that training, you'll learn how to develop a case statement for external donors. That formula that you'll be given there that I've laid out will help you develop those donors, and it'll give you a tool to do so. I believe you are capable of developing a donor list of 100 friends and family. Most people can do that. These are people that are external to the plant and that will give for a short period of time. Don't expect them to give over the long haul. Like everyone else, they'll get donor fatigue. They don't want to give to your ministry for 20 years, but they might give for 2. In that little season of giving, they'll grow, they'll get excited about what you're doing, they'll be blessed by the results. So begin the process of developing a case statement and sharing it with people, and sharing it with prospective donors, and following up and asking them to make a commitment. Now again, I wouldn't do that if I hadn't equipped you with the donor development training that's online. And so please go there and view those sessions. There's a number of them, but they're short. They'll help you a good deal. Finally, we come around to what maybe is the most important, but is very brief. Developing your personal and project prayer team. And the reason I put it here is because I believe that in the donor development work, you've got a key opportunity to develop a prayer team. And to put these two together, link them together. Developing a rich fabric of prayer partners will benefit your ministry, not only from the perspective of the spiritual, if you will, but from the perspective of the human. When people start praying about something, they start thinking about it. And suddenly they're thinking, I've got something that I might be able to donate to that. Or, I know someone that ought to be aware of what you're doing. Hey, I know an individual that ought to be invited to check out what you're doing and get involved. I mean, you get a part of their heart whenever you get a bit of their treasure. After all, that was what Jesus taught. Where our treasure is, our heart ends up going.
We're going to take a little break from Ben's teaching, and I'm going to introduce you to Marty Martins. Actually, Marty's name is Jason, but he goes by Marty. He's the pastor of Unite Church in Salem, South Dakota. Marty actually started that congregation. There were about 20 or 30 people there from a previous church. He was able to turn down conference funding. How about that? Salem is networked with Embrace Church in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, the fastest growing United Methodist church in the country, or at least it has been for the last several years. They give some guidance and coaching. They stream in preaching. But everything else is done by Marty as the leader of Salem. They have their own governance, and it's not what you would call a campus. So. Here's Marty.
For me, my prayer life is the thing that ultimately does bring me life and gives me the strength to move forward. So with that, every morning I have my prayer closet. One day is prayers of thanksgiving and adoration. The next day is prayers for people in our community. The next day is more people that aren't in my sphere here in Salem, but rather out in my life, my family, my friends, my mentors. My mentor, he's deeply rooted in the house of prayer. Being able to be raised up in that has given me a heart to just be with the Lord. We here at Unite Church make prayer the root of what we're about. Personally, the other things that are important, fasting. I try to fast once a week just to realign with the will of God and desiring to continue to stay within that, not just from a church perspective, but just me personally, that I would continue to be rooted in what He is calling me to do. When I'm hungry, it's a time to go to the Lord, to take steps of faithfulness.
Begin to think about developing your personal and project prayer team, and begin to think about how are you going to get 100 prayer partners? And then the next question is, how are you going to begin to regularly communicate with them? 4 simple principles. Tell stories. Tell them often. People remember stories. Stories are indicators of ministry progress. Dominate your communication with stories. Number 2, write to grow your audience, not to get more from them. Teach your audience about mission work in North America, about evangelism, about church planting, in a way that is appropriate for that communication. Continue to make them aware of your gratitude, thankfulness for their contribution. Thank them for goodness sakes, and you'll get more from them. Be consistent. Oh, if there's a story I've heard more than I care to, it's that a donor begins to give and they never hear anything from the recipient. That's a big mistake. And finally, don't be afraid of offering other ways to get involved. Sometimes external donors can become involved in some of the short-term startup needs that you might need during your ministry. For instance, you might need some short-term nursery help down the road. You might need some short-term help with physical plant building. I've watched that from time to time. All of that around the prayer ministry, a great and important part of your foundational work. And that's really what this session has been about today. We're really doing foundational work. It's critical work, and there are a number of action areas. So number 1, develop a 4-year graduated budget with clear metrics as to the number of givers, the amount of the average gift, the annual internal giving with monthly need, and the external support need, and the overall project external support need. Draft this out in paper. Number 2, identify a person who will be your key financial secretary, and if possible, that person should be part of your launch team as soon as possible, and connect them to John Mitchum, and you'll see I've left you John Mitchum's contact information. John works in this area with all of our church plants to empower them around the best practices in funding and stewardship development. Number 3, view the Raising Funds and Developing Stewards New Start series and develop an attractive case statement that uses the format that you've been given, and update it with pictures and begin to use it in your donor development. Develop a list of at least 100 donor prospects and begin the process of communicating the case with them. And then number 5, develop a list of 100 prayer supporters for the ministry that are not attenders, but are those that will surround you in the ministry with intercession. Map out a plan to communicate with them at least 6 times a year. Hey, that sounds like a timeline exercise, doesn't it? So begin to put those post-it notes on your timeline to map that out. Revisit that planning timeline. What post notes can you add with dates to indicate that you've completed activities? Be sure and include the dates when you aim to have reached the number of givers, benchmarks, monthly or annually, and include dates when you will communicate with outside donors with initial requests and ministry updates. And finally, connect with the Director of Congregational Development and your coach when you have completed those action areas so that you can move on to the next equipping session, boot camp number 3. But this boot camp number 2 is a really important one. I acknowledge that for some of us, finances do not come intuitively. So put a little extra effort in, put things down in writing, press through the calculation work so that you get clarity on how many giving units do you need to develop. Those are people that are growing as disciples, followers of Christ. And as we said earlier, they aren't really a disciple if they haven't begun to give. Now, we understand that many donors won't begin to give $120 a month in one big step, even though that's only 3% of a $40,000 income. But here's the principle to remember, and with this principle I will close. When someone gives just a small amount, when you gather together your first small group and you say, you know what, we're going to take up a collection because this ministry is built on generosity and discipleship formation at every level, which includes generosity. When people give just a little bit, they begin to give a little of their heart. And when you get a little of their heart, here's the principle. It's easier to grow an existing giver than it is to get a new one. And so grow people from a few dollars, grow them from tippers, from payers, the people that will pay for ministry. They say, hey, that was a good small group, I'll pay $5. Grow them to being givers, where they say, you know what, I'm not here for just what I get out of it. I'm here because generosity is a quality of life that's the Jesus way. And I'm growing into that as part of my partnership with this Jesus community. I hope this has been helpful to you. And again, if you have the need to process, you know how to get a hold of us. And your coach is always there. God bless you as you continue to do your planting work.